Hello guys, this is your friend and we are back with a new fanfic. Which is what if Naruto didn't save Hinata from the bullies and his life changed and got Harem, part 1. And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic. As Naruto dragged his feet through the many lumps and mounds of snow covering the footpath in front of him, the child was made keenly aware of just how empty the park around him was. Able to count every single tree and bush standing in his line of sight, their trunks grayed and iced over from the many days of frost that had already passed, the 6-year-old in the white and orange jacket and blue pants glanced over his shoulder, where he spotted the familiar building of Konoha's Ninja Academy standing at the other end of the tunnel of foliage. Noticing all the other kids from his class playing in the yard just beneath the academy's famous red sign hanging over the main entrance, the spiky-haired blonde let out a long, dejected sigh. Man, and I thought I'd be able to get to play with someone today, Naruto thought, turning around and kicking at the ground again as he continued to slog forward. Guess I was wrong. And his day had been going so well too. Since this morning, he was able to make a good impression on Iruka-sensei by answering a few of the questions he was able to pose to the class. He did the work set for the students and finished on time, and he even did a pretty cool drawing during free study too. However, when it came time for the lunch play period and Naruto attempted to ask several of the kids if he could play with them, they all turned him down and told him to go away. Even after all of the effort he'd put into doing his work for the day and hoping that it would result in some good karma for him, all the child got back were a bunch of cold shoulders and disgusted expressions from the boys and girls. Needless to say, it had been a very disheartening turn of events. This led to the youngster going on yet another solitary walk through the academy's local reserve, an area that encompassed the entire property the school was built on. After managing to walk through the tunnel leading away from the building, Naruto eventually happened upon the wooden swing hanging next to the path. It was the place he usually went to whenever he was upset, needed to clear his head, or didn't have anything else to do. However, instead of deciding to play and sulk on this piece of equipment like he had countless times before, the blonde instead adjusted his red scarf, fixed the goggles he had over his forehead, and kept on walking. Stepping off the frozen path and into the slumbering forest surrounding this part of the school, Naruto tried to find something else to occupy himself with. At first, he spent his time playing amongst the trunks, running between them, and hopping over a fallen log by pretending it was on fire. He even gathered up some snow to throw it at a low-hanging branch to see if he could dislodge the mound that had gathered on top of it. These acts of self-play occupied him for a short while, before once again leaving him with next to nothing to do. It was one of the many burdens he had to live with, being completely and utterly alone. No family, no parents, no friends. Honestly, no matter how many times he was reminded of his state of existence, Naruto knew he would never get used to it. Hearing the sound of kids laughing and playing in the background as he marched through the cold snow had the boy click his tongue in annoyance while pocketing his hands. This sucks. I hate it, he thought, pushing his shoulders up as he felt his feet starting to get affected by walking through the snow. I just want this all to change. Around the time the blonde thought his day was just going to keep going downhill, a new commotion nearby suddenly caught his attention. The distinct sounds of cackling reaching his ears and causing his head to perk up, Naruto quickly tracked the disturbance to a clearing nearby. When he looked past the tree, he saw 3 boys surrounding a girl, all of whom were looking at her with rather foul and unpleasant grins on their faces. Quickly moving over to get a closer look, the whiskered blonde immediately recognized the young men as boys from a class 2 years above his own, a typical, bland-looking trio with average skills and average test scores. It was a group that the blonde had had a couple of encounters with in the past, both of which had not ended well for him. Though Naruto had no idea what the 3 boys' names were, he certainly knew what kind of crowd they ran with. They were the kind that were too proud and too smart for their own good, who made a living looking down on him and picking on others for either being weird or being weak. In other words, They were a mob made up of the kind that Naruto hated and despised the most. As soon as the blonde laid eyes on them and saw what they were up to, a frown quickly graced his lips and his hands clenched into fists. His grip only seemed to tighten even more when he heard their exasperating squawking transform into words, all of which were being directed to the small girl standing between them. "Hey, we know you," one of the boys exclaimed. "You're that puny shrimp who fell off the monkey bars on the obstacle course that one time." Another of the youngsters laughed. "The one that didn't even make it halfway across. Yeah, you fell flat in the mud and went crying to the nurse's office." The boss of the trio, a kid wearing a green jacket, striped scarf and a backwards-facing red cap, shouted again while leaning forward and grinning meanly. "My friends and I saw what happened from the second floor of the school. The sound you made when you hit the floor was great. Ha ha. Yeah, it was hilarious." The fattest, shortest boy of the group wearing a beanie chuckled. Observing from where he stood behind the tree, Naruto saw that the three older boys were pestering a young girl he couldn't remember ever seeing before. Figuring that she was new to the school, the blonde saw the youngster they were antagonizing was a young female of 6 years of age, with light ivory skin, light brown eyes, and long brown hair that was braided into a ponytail that hung over her left shoulder. Unlike the other girls in the school, who liked to wear a lot of casual clothes during the seasons, this one was dressed very elegantly, sporting a purple kimono that was cut just below the knees, a pink obi wrapped around her torso, a thick white scarf around her neck, and wooden sandals with white socks underneath for the cold. She was much shorter compared to the three boys, making the sight reminiscent of a kitten being preyed upon by three older cats. Judging from her posture as well, she appeared to be very scared and upset, as evident by how her arms were folded in front of her to protect the folder she was carrying, and the way her face was cast downwards and twisted as if attempting to hold back tears. The sight was enough to draw a low growl from Naruto's throat. His disapproval was only further elevated when he saw the boys continue to pick on her. "You're really funny looking for a girl. All dressed up and colorful like a flower," the boss of the trio exclaimed, at the same time getting his face right up in front of the girls and causing her to lurch back in a distressed manner. "This is a school for ninjas. Not flowers. Ha ha, look at her. She's scared." The rotund youngster laughed, at the same time reaching forward and giving her a good shove, causing the girl to whimper fearfully. The sight also caused a watching Naruto's teeth to clench and fists to ball even tighter, indicating his patience was finally reaching its limits. "Are you frightened, little flower? Why would the teachers let such a weak little chicken into our school?" the third, tallest boy asked, drawing another round of laughs from his companions. Naruto, figuring he'd seen enough of this nonsense, prepared to storm forward and confront the bullies. However, upon taking a step forward, the blonde's shoulder hit the trunk of the tree that he was standing next to, which stopped him in his tracks. This in turn gave him pause for thought. "There's 3 of them," Naruto thought. 3 against 1. Yeah, he remembered being in this situation before, all alone, outnumbered, and with no backup or help to speak of. The worst thing about these kinds of bullies was that they were only a threat when they were in a place where no one could see them and in groups, which allowed them to gang up on whoever they had as their target and overwhelm them with brute force. Looking back on all his previous encounters, Naruto realized that while confronting them head-on was bold, admirable, and allowed him to flex his valor in a big way, it was also incredibly risky and stupid. His numerous trips to the nurse's office and days spent in bed recovering were big proof of this, which quickly had him back down on his initial charge. If he tried going in the way he was, he knew right away that he was going to get his to him. With his clumsy, impromptu impact with the tree trunk helping him to restart his brain, the boy quickly began thinking up a different strategy. Looking down at the ground, the boy spied a pile of snow resting alongside some half-buried rocks and sticks, along with some foliage that was slowly decomposing due to the harsh conditions surrounding them. After looking at this stuff and then glancing up at the tree next to him, Naruto was then hit with an idea. A determined grin spreading across his lips, the blonde then ducked down and began stuffing his pockets with rocks. As for the bullies, they were really starting to get their jollies picking on the girl, which prompted them to start ramping up their efforts. You should just go home. Stop coming to this school and wasting everybody's time, the fat boy said while puffing his chest out. Only strong, brave people are able to become ninjas. Not timid little flower girls like you, the boss remarked afterwards, causing the girl to flinch. Think about becoming something else, the taller boy concluded with a nod, his thin mouth grinning broadly while his earmuffs slid up his head slightly. Something that the weak, boring villagers can do. Glancing up at the lead boy from under her fringe, the well-dressed youngster sniffed before speaking in a soft voice. I. The trio's leader stepped even closer to her, to the point his grinning mug was right up in front of her. Huh, what's that? Speak up. I can't hear you. Clenching her teeth, the shivering, tearful child then lifted her head and barked as loudly as she dared at the three boys. I want to become a ninja. Nothing else, you jerks. Her shout, which was broken by the sound of her voice squeaking part way through, had the three youngsters pause for a moment, before they then started guffawing hysterically once again. Clutching their sides and throwing their heads back, the pack of hyenas continued to revel in the sight of the girl's defiant, tearful face glaring back at them, before the leader swung his head back down and scoffed at her. In your dreams, dummy. A useless girl like you will never become a ninja. The fat one shouted. What's this? The tall one shouted, at the same time attempting to snatch the folder the girl was carrying out of her hands. Managing to get his fingers on it, he then yanked it to him, only to meet immediate resistance when the younger girl's hands snapped around the book and pulled it back. The boy grunted when he attempted to pull it from her but ended up struggling when the youngster fought back. Rag, give it here. No, the girl shouted, growling as she wrestled with the clearly stronger boy as she felt her grip starting to falter. Let go. Let go. Ha. Like hell Olga. A shout of pain left the boy's lips when his head was unexpectedly knocked to the side by something small and hard hitting him square in the temple. His friend stood surprised, as did the girl when she felt the tall bully release his hold on her folder, allowing her to backpedal out of harm's way. By the time the taller boy regained his balance, he and his companions realized he'd been hit in the head with a small stone, which then had them look around in alarm. Hey, who threw that? The boss shouted, only to give a yelp of his own when he was struck in the face by a thick ball of snow, which cracked against his cheek and splattered all over him. Up here, you morons. A voice called out, drawing the boys' attention upwards. When all eyes in the area fixed upon the top of a nearby tree, they saw the smirking form of Naruto standing there and looking down at them. Not expecting to get attacked by another kid from out of the blue, the three bullies were unable to say or do anything when the whiskered youngster, tossing a ball of snow up and down in his hand, then cranked back said hand and pitched the ball down at them. Take this, Naruto shouted, hitting the rotund kid right on the top of the head. Ow! The boy shouted when the ball of snow exploded against his skull and splattered down his neck and jumper. What in the? The boss, growling through clenched teeth, then waved a fist up at the blonde. Hey, just who the hell do you think you are? He was effectively cut off by another object hitting him in the face, this time a rock. Clutching the spot where the tiny rock had hit, the youngster stumbled backwards in alarm while at the same time the brown-haired girl watched the scene with a look of utter surprise and intrigue. Ow ow ow, that freakin' hurt. Grinning at seeing the boy's rank broken, Naruto then grabbed a handful of rocks from his pocket, loaded his other hand with one, and inhaled deeply. Bombard meat. Upon giving his gutsy battle cry, the blonde then began chucking rock after rock down at the three boys in the clearing, using devilishly spot-on aim to hit each of them one after the other at random. Quickly shielding themselves with their arms, the three boys braced themselves as they suddenly came under fire by the clever little monkey up in the tree. While a couple of them attempted to pick up some rocks and return fire, thanks to the position he'd chosen and the high angle Naruto was elevated at, none of the boys' shots were able to make their mark. So, With counter-attacking being useless and with no effective cover to speak of, all the bullies could do was stand there and flail their arms uselessly as they were subjected to the relentlessly rain of attacks being thrown at them by the whiskered youngster. Naruto's assault was relentless. Due to the high volume of rocks and sticks he'd collected, the blonde was able to spam the shit out of his ammunition as he threw not only large rocks, but entire fistfuls of gravel. Not letting up for even a moment, he kept on hawking rocks even when the one of the boys got cut above the eye and another one started crying. When several of the rocks clipped their ears, legs and other weak spots, sending sharp bolts of pain shooting through them, the alarmed and disorientated bullies made the wise and unanimous decision to retreat. The boss went first, turning heel and running, while his two friends sprinted after him. We'll get you for this, you twerp. You hear me? The older boy's voice cried out, followed immediately by a comical, ow, when he ended up hit in the butt cheek by another rock thrown by Naruto. Taking aim with another big one, the blonde prepared to throw it. But when he saw the three boys vanish, the youngster lowered his round stone and nodded victoriously, before then dropping down from the tree to touch down in the snow. Jogging forward, he then shouted after them. And don't come back, Dadbao. Naruto barked, kicking at the snow in a sign of dominance. His heart still pounding in his ears, the whiskered youngster huffed and smiled happily, as for the first time in his life he'd finally managed to win a fight. Allowing his triumph to marinate for a little while, the child then let out a sharp breath of air, before spinning around to face the girl he'd helped save. Seeing her standing beside a tree a few yards away, the youngster quickly trotted over to her. When he stopped and saw the youngster stiffen up, Naruto then gave her a look of concern. Are you okay? He asked. Feeling her breath catch in her throat, the brown-haired girl initially had no idea how to respond. At first, finding herself backed into a corner and pressed into a situation where she had no chance of evading her antagonists, the newcomer to the academy soon found herself playing the part of a witness to the most spectacular display of heroism she could ever remember seeing. A boy with blonde hair, whiskers, and a red scarf, taking the high ground against a group of older bullies and chasing them off, all by his lonesome. And most surprising of all, he looked to be about the same age as she was. Swallowing nervously at the sincere smile she saw her spiky-haired hero give her, the girl in the purple kimono and white scarf nodded meekly. Why yes, I'm fine. Thank you. When she saw the child brighten up at her expression of gratitude, the brunette felt her own sense of self perk up. That was amazing. I can't believe you managed to chase those awful boys away. Naruto, feeling his chest swell slightly at the girl's remark, chuckled while rubbing his nose in a bashful manner. Well, to be honest, I didn't think I'd be able to pull it off. Most of the time I try to fight off whole groups of idiots, I always end up getting ganged up on and having the stuffing kicked out of me. He then clenched his fist and held it in front of him tightly. But I showed them. This time, I'm the one giving the smackdown. Not them. Heartbeat racing, the girl beamed as she stepped closer to the whiskered child. You were so brave. Upon getting a good look at his face and seeing him smile back at her, the girl suddenly blinked in realization. Oh, hang on. Why, you're from Iruka-sensei's class. Naruto blinked in surprise and lowered his arm. Yeah, I am. He then leaned forward slightly. Have we met? The girl shook her head. No, but I remember seeing you out on the quad a few times during fitness and shinobi training. You did, huh? Naruto murmured, not sure whether her seeing him was a good thing or a bad thing, especially when he couldn't ever remember spotting her amongst a crowd. Surely a well-dressed girl like her would be easy to make out. Guess he was still as dense as ever. Relaxing a little, the blonde smiled. I guess that must mean you're from Suzume-sensei's class. From room 2A. The girl nodded her head briskly before smiling warmly at the blonde, her cheeks reddening as she looked back at him. I'm Yakumo Kurama. She then became somewhat embarrassed as she straightened her arms in front of her over her folder and rocked nervously on the spot. What's your name? The blonde youngster cracked a smile. I'm Naruto. Naruto Uzumaki. It's nice to meet you. For the first time in his entire life, Naruto felt like his string of bad luck, misfortune, and loneliness had finally been turned around. Barring his brief stint of solitude during the first half of that lunch play period, the young academy student had done the unthinkable and come out ahead, not only managing to scare off a group of bullies who would have kicked the crud out of him on any other day, but also triumphing over them and saving someone from their machinations in the process. On top of that, he'd also managed to capture the interests of this exact same person, who not only developed an immediate liking in him, but found a great deal of intrigue in his character and personality. Following their first meeting out in the forest and exchanging of names, the pair of odd, kind, yet lonely children wasted no time in making the most of that moment to talk and hang out. Using up whatever lunch play they had left, the pair gabbed about themselves, commented on the weather, and had a short walk through the forest together. During this time Naruto was able to show Yakumo the swing he used and would often hang on whenever he was alone so that she could have a play on it. He even gave her a push when she asked him to help her, which he happily did. Unfortunately, the time that the pair had left to enjoy their break period was cut off by the sound of the school bell going off a few minutes later, telling all the children who were out to return to class. Before the pair parted ways after walking one another back to the entrance, both Naruto and Yakumo quickly set times and places where they could meet up with one another in the upcoming days. Clearly the two of them weren't done learning about the other kid that they'd just met, and both were eager to make the most of this fated encounter. And so, in the weekdays following his epic shootout with the boys in the snow, Naruto found himself eagerly waking up every morning so that he could rush to school and meet up with Yakumo. Every day, without fail, the pair would greet each other at the front of the academy before homeroom, where they would then hang out and chat outside before walking each other to their classrooms. And then at recess and lunch, after all their work and studying for the in-between periods was finished, the pair would rendezvous in the quad and go to either play in the forest or hang out in the clearing beside the playground. And then, at the end of the day, both would spend their time wandering the markets and parks outside of the school together before heading home. The best part about all of this is that unlike the other kids Naruto had tried to spend time with before, Yakumo didn't leave him after the first few days of play due to unknown or family reasons. In fact, the girl seemed incredibly adamant in wanting to hang out with the boy during their free time, which helped to bring a sense of warmth and comfort to the blonde's otherwise bleak and miserable weeks. The reason for her insistence in this matter was quite an interesting tale. Since Yakumo started late at the academy and was new to the whole school system, she hadn't had the opportunity to make any friends. A lot of the kids didn't know her, due to the fact she'd spent most of her early years studying at home, and a lot of the girls avoided her because she seemed very different from them. Naruto found out on their second lunch period together that the reason Yakumo hadn't come to school before was because she was born with a weak body and had to be raised at home for the first few years in order to grow and get stronger. It was only recently, after developing a little more and insisting to her parents that she wanted to be with other kids her own age, that she was finally allowed to sign up at the academy. Sadly, even though she was a very friendly, outgoing and kind young girl, Yakumo had been unable to make any headway in connecting with others or becoming part of any groups. Even after months of trying, Yakumo was still looked upon as the black sheep in the class by the rest of her peers. It was only until the winter season that she was finally able to interact with someone, and that person was more than eager to become a part of her life. Thus, Yakumo welcomed Naruto with open arms, as did the blonde. In the weeks that came and went following their first afternoon spent together, the pair spent many days stuck to one another like glue. Given their age and level of knowledge, the pair spent a lot of hours hanging out on the playground, walking through the woods, and chatting enthusiastically with one another. When they would play, they would partake in some light ball games on the grass, run around the climbing equipment having a game of pretend, play hide and seek, or sit side by side on the swing sets just kicking it back. Because Yakumo's body was still very weak and her stamina still had much to be desired, the girl couldn't play very hard with Naruto for very long, so the blonde learned quickly to go easy on her whenever they were running around. Whenever she got tired, the pair would sit together on the grass or bench and chat for the remainder of the period. This being the first time they had anyone their own age to really talk to, the two of them would gab on and on about all sorts of topics, including the weather, their likes, their dislikes, the food that they ate over the weekend, the food they were going to eat for dinner, the things their teachers talked about in class, the kind of games they liked or wished to play, and their interests. Since time seemed to fly by for everyone during recess and lunch, the pair were only given so many minutes to talk and play, at least 30 minutes per block. This meant that the two of them were able to stretch out entire subjects for days at a time. Despite this rather inconvenient obstacle, as well as the fact that their time was divided up between classes and learning, Naruto and Yakumo still had a great time hanging out together. By the time winter turned to spring and a new season started, both kids had become incredibly close friends, to the point it became a common sight to see the two of them hanging out during every break and in public. For the kids that knew Naruto and who he was, seeing him spending so much time with another student was an incredibly bizarre and surreal spectacle. But for a couple of the teachers, namely Iruka Yumino, seeing the blonde he viewed as a younger brother finally simmer down from his normally trouble-making self and begin devoting his time and energy towards fostering a friendship with someone, was an incredibly heartwarming sight. XXX. A couple months later, with the curriculum at the school now starting to ramp up its program for the students and setting higher expectations for them as they moved forward with their growth, the kids began undergoing new lessons and learning about a whole range of new topics. A lot of these in-class sessions focused on their training as shinobi, strategy on the field, and the use of ninjutsu, all of which the students were very keen about learning. When the new semester started, Naruto and Yakumo's conversations quickly turned to their interests in the ninja arts. Much to their pleasant surprise, both kids were extremely passionate about the philosophies and practices of a shinobi, and that they were both very enthusiastic about becoming strong, capable shinobi in the future. While Naruto said that he wanted to become Hokage, Yakumo said she wanted to become an elite jonin, the best in her clan's history. This discussion eventually led to the pair sharing the knowledge and abilities that they'd already accumulated in their few years of study. Since the school had already taught the students early on about chakra control and manipulating it to perform basic, supplementary techniques, this meant that there were a few moves that the pair could show off to one another. Naruto took to this with great enthusiasm, forming a cross-fingered hand seal and concentrating his energy with a single burst. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, shadow clone technique, the young blonde uttered through a big grin, as he and Yakumo stood across from one another in the clearing of the forest they regularly ventured into during lunch. As his friend looked on with intense fascination, both saw two big puffs of white smoke go up from the ground between them. The anomaly initially startled the brunette, but when she eventually saw the veil clear and focused her eyes to see what had happened, she was incredibly surprised by what she saw waiting for her. Two tiny Naruto clones no bigger than a pair of mice adorned in tiny orange vests, shorts, and goggles were standing in front of the boy and grinning up at Yakumo. When they saw the girl blink down at them, the chibi doppelgangers both clenched their fists and greeted her with gusto. "Hey there, how are you doing, Datbayo?" they both exclaimed in two identically squeaky voices. At first there was an awkward moment of pause, in which a dumbfounded Naruto and an incredibly surprised Yakumo stared down at the two tiny shadow clones he'd created. After several seconds of waiting, during which time nothing else really happened, the brown-haired girl snorted under her breath, before suddenly covering her face with her arm and beginning to laugh uncontrollably. The sound of her giggles caused the blonde to blush and look up at her with a frown. What?" he asked, clearly embarrassed by what had just happened. While the boy's two insignificant creations continued to stare up at the girl in confusion, the snickering academy student quickly calmed herself down. "Oh, sorry, Yakumo said through fits of giggles, taking a deep breath before reaching up to brush a stray tear from the corner of her eye. It's just that they're both so adorable. The fact that she clapped her hands at the end illustrated exactly how delightful the clones were, which caused both of them to grin happily. Blushing at having his jutsu referred to as cute, Naruto clenched his fists and barked in a flustered manner. I'm working on it, alright. His exclamation earning another giggle from Yakumo. The blonde boy then recoiled and lowered his head. At the same time his tiny doppelgangers quietly looked between their creator and the girl in an intrigued fashion. I learned about the shadow clones from a book I found in the school library, as well as the steps on how to perform it. But since it's classified as AB rank jutsu, the technique is very, very hard to learn. Yakumo tilted her head at the youngster curiously. Oh, why are you trying to learn it, exactly? Sure, it seemed like a pretty useful technique in practice. But considering its rank and the form it took, she had to wonder why the blonde would focus so much attention on trying to get the thing working. Especially since it seemed quite complex in its execution. At this question, Naruto inhaled sharply and looked up at her attentively. I heard that if an academy student manages to master the Kage Bunshin, they get an automatic pass on the Bunshin no Jutsu clone technique exam. Since I completely suck at the ordinary Bunshin technique, I figured I could learn this one instead. He then reached up and scratched his cheek nervously, while the two clones he'd made below started laughing and fighting with each other. I also found out that some kid named Itachi was automatically made a genin when he used the technique halfway through his first year. Plus, I figured it would be really cool to know a move that others didn't. I see, Yakumo murmured, considering his two tiny clones for a moment. Upon which she then took a deep breath, adjusted the brown satchel she had hanging off her shoulder, and smiled up at her friend. Well, even if you can't use it perfectly just yet, to learn such a difficult technique and to be able to get this far on your own, you should be really proud of yourself, Naruto-kun. Being put at ease by the girl's encouraging statement and compliment towards his efforts, the child smiled back at her. Thanks. That really means a lot to hear that. When he looked down and saw his two tiny shadow clones beginning to punch it out with one another, resulting in a very hilarious little boxing match, Naruto dismissed them with a quick hand seal before looking back up at the brunette. Though I still can't create a proper clone, I'm still really good at the Henge no Jutsu transformation technique, and the Kawarimi no Jutsu replacement technique. Iruka-sensei gave me top marks for those two. He then formed a fist, lifted it, and clapped it against his chest. I'm also the fittest and strongest in my class, since I can lift 5 to 10 times more than anyone else, including that idiot Sasuke. Really? Yakumo asked, sounding quite surprised when she heard the blonde reveal this little nugget of information. Naruto nodded his head enthusiastically. Sensei gave us all a strength test recently to see how much weight we could pick up, and I was able to lift and hold the most over my head. He then held out his hand proudly and spoke in a big voice. 15 stones from a stationary position. Wow, Yakumo whispered, promptly doing the math in her head and realizing that from the number Naruto quoted, he could lift an amount equivalent to the weight of a full-grown adult man, maybe even more. And he was only 6 years old. This information had her shake her head in amazement. You must have a really strong body to be able to hold up that much, she remarked, appearing quite impressed at the boy's note on his physical capabilities. Right, Dadbeo, Naruto responded, before placing his hands on his hips confidently. I guess lifting stuff and punching hard are two things that I'm really good at. Cracking a smile, the brunette beamed approvingly in the boy's direction. I wish I was as strong as you are, Naruto-kun. That way my parents won't have to worry about me getting hurt all the time, and I can move and act like how a real ninja is supposed to. She then looked away momentarily and rubbed her hand uneasily. I'm really good with books and strategy, but I'm terrible at ninjutsu and taijutsu. Every time I try to do one round of shadow sparring or a simple jutsu, my body gets really tired or my head starts to spin. It's annoying. Hearing this, Naruto paused for a moment before then breaking out a smile. You might not be strong now, but I'm sure with enough training and practice you'll be able to get much, much better. You just have to be patient and keep working on it, is all. Scratching her cheek, the girl looked up bashfully at the youngster. You think so? I know so, Naruto nodded, before then puffing his chest out eagerly. You're already super clever and super good at problem solving. Heck, you're already better than me at all the memory games we've played. Not to mention Shogi and Othello. If you can get good at those things, I'm sure that with enough hard work you'll be able to get tough enough to lift as many stones as I can. He then gave the girl a wide grin of encouragement. Feeling incredibly moved by his words of encouragement and blushing at his cute smile, the brunette nodded to the young man happily. Thank you, Naruto-kun. I'll try my best, she said, at the same time clenching a hand tightly. Invigorated by their conversation thus far, Naruto stepped up to the girl with an excited glint in his eye. Is there anything else that you can do besides awesome strategy and planning? Oh, at first appearing surprised by the sudden question, the youngster in the purple kimono quickly looked down at herself, before promptly bringing out the folder she was carrying in her satchel. Well, I'm really good at painting. Painting, Naruto repeated. Yakumo nodded, yes. She then held up the folder she was carrying, undid the string at the end, and opened it up. When the blonde came over to take a closer look at the A4 sheets she had inside the folio, he blinked in astonishment when he saw two different watercolored paintings, both of which were set in places he recognized from Konohagakure. See, I do a lot of pictures and drawings in my free time and for training. I've gotten so good at them that they look like photos. She then proceeded to flip through the pages one after the other, showing Naruto multiple locations around and outside the hidden leaf. The further they ventured, more and more of the town was exposed to the boy's eyes, until Yakumo started showing him paintings of places he'd never been to before. A beach, an ocean by the cliffs, a temple in the mountains, a tower in a city, a lighthouse, a jungle, a swamp, and all sorts of other locations that appeared both tranquil and peaceful. When the girl stopped on a couple of the above-mentioned pieces, the blonde was given time to marvel at the details behind each painting, demonstrating a skill the girl had that he, for all definitions of the word, lacked. Well, Yakumo's soft voice spoke up when she noticed the look of surprise drawn across the boy's face. What do you think? Swallowing nervously, the whiskered youngster glanced up at the girl and grinned. I think they're awesome. His exclamation caused the brunette to giggle at his excitement, to which he then leaned forward and pointed at one of the paintings she'd done, one beside a river with a massive waterfall in the background. You're super talented, Yakumo-chan. I had no idea you could draw so well. Feeling her heart race and face heat up from the bombardment of compliments Naruto was generously giving to her, Yakumo had to give herself a moment to calm down. Once she'd taken a breath to steady herself, she then gave the young man a warm smile. That's not the only thing I'm good at. When she saw his eyes turn to her, the child grinned. Would you like to visit one of these places, Naruto-kun? Huh, the whiskered boy balked, hearing her question loud and clear, but not understanding what she meant. After his brain finally clicked over to form a response, Naruto finally gave an awkward nod. Sure, I guess. Then, without any other word or warning, the brunette brought a hand up and formed a one-handed hand sign. The instant she did, Naruto, much to his utter surprise, suddenly saw the world of the Academy's tranquil forest bleed away and become replaced by the bright, glittering, serene landscape of a vast, lush mountain valley, complete with a large waterfall pouring over the side of a cliff in the distance. The sounds of the local birds and children playing in the Academy's quad and playground were also replaced by the delightful crackling of leaves rustling overhead and the low, continuous pounding of water cascading into a lake in the distance. Stumbling away from Yakumo by several feet, the child looked around in alarm, his wide eyes taking in the gorgeous, colorful scenery of the area as the warmth of the newly positioned sun shone down on him from above. His senses, cranked up to full volume, became overwhelmed by the sudden shift in tone and location, alerting him to a brand new onslaught of sensations now starting to invade his space. The transition had been completely sudden and unexpected. Whoa! Naruto exclaimed, doing a full turn as his eyes scanned the sky and then landed on the waterfall in the distance. What did you do? Yakumo giggled at the look of awe and wonder on the boy's face. This is the other thing that I'm good at, making genjutsu. When she saw the boy's eyes look to her, the girl beamed broadly while setting her drawing and painting book under her arm. While you may be good at hitting hard and fighting off bullies, I'm good at creating and building whole worlds around me. The blonde nodded dumbly while looking about in disbelief. No kidding. Wow. This is unbelievable, he remarked, moving over to one of the vine-covered bushes and slowly reach out to the red flowers growing on it. So, this is genjutsu. It's my first time seeing it for myself. Naruto then recoiled slightly when his fingers touched the flower and he felt the distinct sensation of soft petals and bristles of the vine brush against his skin. It feels so real. Was this supposed to be an illusion? By his understanding of what he'd learned about genjutsu in Iruka's classes, illusion-based techniques were designed to fool, betray, and trick the senses of shinobi, nullifying their strength and redirecting it without even laying a hand on them. Depending on the type of technique used, a person targeted by the move could have his sight deceived by an illusion cast on the surrounding environment, their sense of smell fooled by an alteration in odor, or their balance offset by a change in sound. But this illusion went beyond anything he was expecting. It was almost like he'd been transported to an entirely different part of the continent. Hell, maybe even a different reality. Yakumo, noticing the concern and confusion coming over the blonde's face, beamed warmly at him. It only seems real because I'm making you believe it's real. Though, that's what ordinary genjutsu is meant to do, the girl informed, drawing the boy's astonished gaze back to her. When she saw she had his full and undivided attention, the brunette perked up as a glow of pride appeared in her gaze. My genjutsu is special. Because of my family's bloodline, not only are my illusions capable of tricking people's minds, but they are also strong enough to affect a person's body and organs. She then raised her finger and pressed her finger and thumb together. On top of that, not only are my illusions able to take physical form, they can also completely erase presences, refract matter, and transport entire groups of people to separate dimensions, trapping them inside a labyrinth of colors and wonder. It was upon hearing this that Naruto felt the urge to gulp and grin nervously at his friend. That actually sounds kind of scary. The brunette giggled while stepping towards him. It's what genjutsu is designed to do. Yakumo then stopped in front of the blonde and beamed up at him. My clan is famous for producing the greatest genjutsu specialists on the continent. And since I'm a member of the main family, I inherited all of my clan's abilities and then some. She then tilted her head at the young man in front of her. Though I'm not even close to mastering all of my skills, I still wanted to show you what I could do, my first friend. A shrug soon followed her statement. So, do you like it? Naruto, grinning excitedly, turned to face the girl fully. Yeah, it's amazing, Yakumo-chan. No, not just amazing. It's incredible. Throwing his hands up in the air, the young man caused the girl to giggle happily at his praise, before the blonde then clenched his fists in front of him. This is the greatest thing I've ever seen anyone in our school ever do. Not even the teachers can do anything close to this. I only wish I could use jutsu as cool as this one. Warmed and captivated by the boy's kind words and excitement, Yakumo raised her head a little as the illusion continued to play around them. Well, how about I teach you? When she saw Naruto balk at her proposal, the brunette smiled. Or better yet, how about we teach each other? I can show you how to study opponents, and create and break out of genjutsu, and you. I can show you how to make your body stronger and use ninjutsu, so that you can fight and move like a proper shinobi. Naruto finished, drawing a nod from his friend as this was exactly what she was going to say to finish off. Yeah, I can totally do that. The two of us can study and train together. Build on our strengths and fix each other's weaknesses. When he saw Yakumo's grin mirror his, the blonde youngster then paused for a moment. But, are you sure you're okay with sharing your family's techniques with me? Aren't they yours? Nodding her head once again, the brunette beamed. Of course. She then placed a finger over her lips and whispered, don't worry. It can be our little secret. Upon seeing the blonde nod in understanding, the young Yakumo then lowered her head as her smile faded a little. I've always wanted to have someone teach me how to act and fight like a shinobi, a real shinobi. But because I was born with such a frail body, my parents were too afraid to let me practice. Even the tutor they hired for me said that I should forget about becoming a kunoichi and focus on becoming something else like a painter or a caretaker. Frowning at this, she then looked back up at Naruto and clenched her fists in front of her. But I don't want to become anything else. I want to become a ninja. A true ninja. Someone who will be able to show the world that even someone as small and weak as me can become something truly special. That is my dream. Naruto, feeling her resolve burning furiously from every fiber of her being, smiled broadly and brought his fist up between them. And I'll help you achieve that dream, Yakumo-chan. You and me, we'll be able to do it, together. Looking down at the boy's fist and seeing it reposition itself so that the side of it was pointing towards her, Yakumo responded with a grin and going purely by instinct raised her arm and bumped the side of her fist against Naruto's. Their forearms resting against one another, both children shared determined smiles, before a series of excited giggles left their lips. It was a pact that the two of them were determined to follow. However, just as they were wrapping up their little agreement, Yakumo suddenly felt a tingle on the back of her neck. The sensation causing her to freeze up momentarily, the girl spun around and looked across the stretch of landscape that was her illusion. Her wide eyes searched the space behind her, searching not only the rolling hills but the trees that lay beyond it. Seconds of searching later, however, the girl spotted nothing. Her reaction did draw a surprised blink from Naruto, who looked in the same direction she was out of worry. Yakumo-chan. Are you alright? Why yeah, I'm okay, Naruto-kun. I just thought I heard something weird, the brunette replied, quickly looking back at him and pulling her drawing book back up. When she gripped the cover, she smiled at the blonde and gestured to him with it. Come on, let's head back. Receiving confirmation from the whiskered youngster, the two then stood together as Yakumo closed her book. Doing so allowed her to cancel the illusion, erasing the mountain valleys and waterfall around them and returning the pair to the middle of the clearing just outside of the academy's main building. Both taking a deep breath once they returned to real world, Naruto and Yakumo sharing one last smile together, then made their way back towards the school's entrance. Along the way, the energetic blonde hero couldn't help but chatter excitedly with his friend over her paintings and asked whether she could create a completely different world with floating castles. As Yakumo contemplated this idea, while at the same time expressing fondness over the idea, unbeknownst to the pair of children, an ominous gaze had fallen upon them. Back in the clearing that they'd been standing in moments ago, between two of the oak trees on the edge of the circle, the form of a disembodied head could be seen floating amidst a thin cloud of purple mist. Appearing human at first, the blue-eyed face slowly crept out into the light, revealing itself to be an oni with two incredibly long horns jutting out of its skull, a thin jawline, and a row of razor-sharp teeth lining its mouth accented by two extra long fangs at the front. Watching the pair of children venture back over to the academy, the ominous demonic presence let out a low growl, before its head eventually faded into nothing and vanished. Before it completely dissipated, the creature uttered one familiar word that seemed to echo on the wind. Yakumo. True to their word, on the very next morning following their little show and tell session in the woods, both Naruto and Yakumo met up in order to begin work on a training plan that the two of them were going to follow for the next year. Not even caring that they'd forced themselves to get up at the crack of dawn when the sun was barely peeking over the horizon, the pair sat down at their usual meeting spot in the playground outside the Shinobi Academy, and began going over the subjects, exercises, and training sessions that they would undergo in order to work towards achieving their goals. Being the sharp, young and ambitious pair that they made, writing up a timetable for themselves and assigning each other homework in between was a simple enough and straightforward task. Having Naruto there to bounce ideas off, as well as point out any subjects she may have missed, helped Yakumo compose a schedule for them that was both balanced and fair. Though there were many things that they desperately wanted to cover in the foreseeable future, both agreed that they needed to take things slow, so that they didn't miss out on anything important. The whole process of writing took them a little over an hour to draft and summarize. However, once Naruto and Yakumo were sure they had everything planned, including their personal exercises, study, meet-up times and locations, the pair then made a copy of their plans and headed off to class. From there, the duo's joint regimen began. The entire process that they'd agreed on was a holistic routine of physical and mental training sessions based on a similar schedule that Yakumo had run with her clan members and her tutor. However, unlike her personalized routine, which only focused on manipulating chakra and controlling her genjutsu, the exercises she included were intense physical exercises and study sessions with Naruto. In order to lay the foundations for the pair's development from that point onwards, they both agreed to start off from scratch. During the Monday to Friday working week, Naruto and Yakumo made the decision to wake up 3 hours before the start of school in order to get an early morning workout in. This involved the blonde taking his friend out into the woods on the far side of the mountain where the Hokage monument was carved, a place he'd often frequented so that she could run some forest obstacle courses, haul rocks, and throw shuriken at static or moving targets that he'd set up there. This training would not only help build their reaction skills and overall coordination, but also enhance their fitness and base physical strengths. As was to be expected, this training was hard going for Yakumo. No, not just hard. It was downright tortuous. Given her background of low stamina and poor physical strength stemming from a weak body, having to follow the same 10-mile route and perform the same exercise types as her blonde friend, was nearly equivalent to a 100-mile hike up a mountain for a normal person, followed by a session of hefting boulders. The first several times Naruto and Yakumo ran the course and did the workouts together, the girl literally collapsed from exhaustion a fraction of the way through. On many occasions she fell over and was unable to move for the rest of the morning. This resulted in her having to drag herself to one of the rest stops on their trek or ask Naruto to carry her. Hell, even afterwards, the fatigue she felt from the morning training was so great she either missed out on a day of school or wound up falling asleep in class, which Suzume-sensei clearly wasn't impressed with. During one return walk to the village after an early finish to their morning segment, as Naruto carried an exhausted and sweaty Yakumo on his back, he made a joke at his expense. He said, "I remember collapsing a few times during that run. Once, I was so frustrated at not being able to beat Kiba's time on the course I worked myself so hard that I passed out. I ended up sleeping out in the woods the entire day and missed out on school." He snickered at the end. Boy, Iruka-sensei was pissed the next morning. When he told the story to Yakumo as she hung off his shoulder, the girl laughed. Listening to Naruto explain to her all the details of the various mishaps that took place during that training helped her to get over the disappointment that she felt at not being able to finish the run for the 20th day in a row. The fact that he was able to share the pains and failures of his past so openly showed that he knew what she was going through with trying to overcome the hurdle of her body's limitations, and that they were both in the same boat. For weeks they kept to the run, repeating it as many times as needed so that Yakumo could adapt to the routine. A few times she succeeded and several times she failed, yet all times ended in the girl gasping her lungs out and sweating up a storm at the end of every leg. At first, she thought her pain would never end and that she would be stuck in the same, wretched circle of running and collapsing for the rest of the year. But after 2 months of hell came and went, and with help from Naruto's continuous encouragement and support, Yakumo slowly but surely started to come into her own. Eventually, after a few months of hard training and care, she managed to get through the 10-mile run consistently without falling over, and the exhaustion she felt at the end of the round and the weightlifting was greatly lessened. The obstacle course and rock lifting in the mornings were accompanied by multiple rounds of taijutsu, in which Naruto and Yakumo would walk through the basic forms together. Initially the blonde had to do them on his own, and Yakumo, being too exhausted from the first 2 blocks of exercises, would observe him. During that time, she would correct the whiskered child's technique and point out any mistakes or gaps in his skill set. Considering her knowledge of all the forms of taijutsu from her studying of the academy's texts and observation of lessons, she knew exactly where Naruto needed to correct his martial arts. This meant Naruto's first month of taijutsu training was basically a restructuring and remodeling of his close combat skills, where he would practice out in the open with shadow sparring to hone his technique and hit a tree bare-fisted for striking. He made sure to work himself to the bone during this portion of their timetable, not just for himself, but also to show Yakumo that he was indeed serious about improving and making good use of their time together. In addition to the usual practices, Naruto later started doing the sessions with sets of wrist and ankle weights he managed to find in the academy's dojo storage area, all of which weighed some several dozen kilograms each. This resulted in a lot of skin chafing, bloody knuckles, and sweat from the energetic blonde, as well as many bruises and torn muscles. Heck, on one particular day, Naruto ended up limping to school due to tearing the fibers in his calf from pivoting too much during a training session. But once he'd managed to iron out his form, towards the end of the first 2 months, the blonde ended up fighting with much more control and finesse than before, but he had a long way to go still before he was close to complete. When Yakumo eventually managed to join in, the training became much more eventful, in which the two started working together to build their skills as a unit. The 3 sets of exercises consisting of the obstacle course, weightlifting, and taijutsu made up the morning sessions for their working week. At recess and lunch, during the mandatory break periods they were given after classes, Naruto and Yakumo would get together and study one-on-one. This part of the day consisted of the girl helping the blonde with the material from the academy that he didn't understand, including those given directly by Iruka for assignments and homework. Everything pertaining to strategy, mathematics and literacy were covered during this part of the day, as well as all the other fundamental knowledge shinobi needed to have. Obviously, Naruto struggled with this area a lot. Much like how Yakumo's weakness was in her physical capabilities and dexterity, the whiskered youngster's Achilles heel was his problem-solving and strategy skills. His friend had to break things down into simple terms and build them up for him, and when she ended up explaining things to him in ways that he could relate, Naruto was able to understand the problems right away. In fact, after the first 2 months came and went, Naruto quickly demonstrated a brand of thinking and strategizing that Yakumo didn't even know he had. It was quite possible that nobody else knew either. The boy was highly kinesthetic with his learning and made connections with material that many would find unusual and unorthodox, such as the stuff he dealt with in day-to-day life, including allowances, food, mental maps, and material that would be considered popular culture for the current generation of the village. A lot of his knowledge came from instinct, and Yakumo was able to exploit his intellect in order to fill in all the gaps in Naruto's brain to make learning and thinking in class a lot more fun and easier for him. At first, she started doing the routines with him out in the woods to help lay the foundations for him using their training as shinobi to better explain angles, trajectories, probability, and how to add or subtract numbers in order to solve the unknown values. Shinobi were expected to be able to do complex mathematics in their head in order to function as commanders and leaders on the field, so Yakumo made sure Naruto had an idea of how this was done through action before having him translate it onto paper. This made his learning later onwards much easier, as his friend was able to give him a visual interpretation of how to solve most of the formulas through practical means. Though it was still a hard slog for him, Naruto, the young man of pure spirit and action, was slowly getting a handle on it. Then came the afternoon sessions. While on Fridays the pair reserved that day for some much-needed fun and play after school, the two used the other days of the week to practice ninjutsu and genjutsu together. This was where a lot of chakra manipulation practice and hand seal work came into action, in which both the boy and the girl took turns in demonstrating to the other how the techniques they didn't specialize in were executed. While Yakumo showed Naruto how to weave signs to produce his own genjutsu without the need for elaborate paintings, the boy taught Yakumo how to perform the standard supplementary ninjutsu, which would set the stage for her hopefully learning many others to follow. On the 14th day of training, Monday, a white puff of smoke surrounded Naruto after the boy finished weaving hand seals. When the veil cleared and an observing Yakumo saw the boy emerge from the mist, she was surprised to see the third Hokage standing in front of her, adorned in his signature white robes, his hands behind his back and his red and white wide hat covering his head. The moment the girl saw the form of the short, frail-looking leader of the village smiling back at her from under the shadow of his headwear, she was immediately blown away by the sight. "It's flawless," she commented, having seen hundreds of pictures of Hiruzen in photographs and in books to know his face off by heart. The figure that was standing before her was a spitting image of the famed god of shinobi. "You look exactly like him, Naruto-kun." Initially keeping a straight, composed look on his face as characteristic of the third Hokage, a few moments later a very cheerful, Naruto grin then crossed the old man's lips. After reaching up and tipping his wide hat to the lady, the Hokage then went up in a second puff of smoke, which quickly lifted away to reveal the whiskered child standing before Yakumo with his fingers gripping his goggles. Since the transformation translated to whatever he was wearing in his real form, the transition between the two was uncanny. "That's how it's done," the boy said, lowering his hand and beaming at the girl. "Normally I would give the transformation a funny nose or big lips or something to try and make people laugh, but I wanted to do a proper transformation this time. Do you think you'll be able to do it?" Swallowing nervously, the brunette in the purple kimono dress clenched her fists and raised them bravely. I don't know. But I'll try." Following her declaration, Naruto stood there with his hands on his hips and watched the girl form a hand seal in front of her. Closing her eyes and concentrating, she then began churning the chakra inside her body to begin the process of the Henge no Jutsu. "Remember, relax. Focus on the image inside your head. Let your chakra flow naturally," Naruto instructed. Nodding in understanding, Yakumo then flipped through the signs necessary for her to perform the technique: dog, boar and ram. Once she finished the technique, she then grunted and allowed her gathered chakra to burst outwards. A white puff of smoke then filled the air as the technique took effect, with Naruto watching as the fog cleared to see the results of the girl's transformation. When she re-emerged, she had managed to adequately take the third Hokage's form complete with hat, robe and wrinkles, just as the blonde had done before. Upon seeing the Hokage open his eyes and glance up at him, Naruto grinned at his friend and pumped his fists triumphantly. "Awesome. You did it, Ya-chan." However, about a few seconds after seeing the transformed Yakumo grin at him, her eyes suddenly rolled upwards before the Hokage duplicate swayed sharply on the spot. Moments later, another puff of smoke occurred as the third keeled over, with Yakumo's form reemerging from the smoke as she dropped to the ground. Seeing his friend hit the lawn they were practicing on had Naruto freak out and rush forward, waving his hands frantically when he saw the swirly-eyed girl lying flat on her back. "Yakumo-chan. Hey, Yakumo-chan. Are you alright? Ya-chan. Ooh, the world won't stop spinning," Yakumo groaned, clearly bowled over for her very first attempt at a jutsu outside of her comfort zone. Hell, she couldn't even hear Naruto shouted over her and asking if she was alright. The earliest round of sessions for the two ambitious children were quite tricky and didn't really amount to anything in terms of actual progress. When Yakumo attempted to do a standard transformation technique, she transformed, smiled, and then passed out due to the sudden spike in chakra as well as from the fact that she was still incredibly exhausted from that morning's stamina training in the woods. While Naruto panicked from seeing his friend collapse after doing such a trivial deed, when she regained consciousness seconds later, the boy quickly calmed down, which then led to him saying that she should hold off on practicing too many ninjutsu until she got her physical strength and stamina up. Yakumo agreed, and from there the two continued working on getting their chakra levels as high and refined as possible, with the kunoichi in training teaching Naruto how to produce and break a standard genjutsu technique on the side. While producing an illusion was something the blonde had never done before due to its high level of difficulty and control, he found it a lot easier than he initially expected after his brunette friend explained to him how it was done through basic terminology. In a way, mastering a generic genjutsu was very similar to the transformation technique, only you projected your chakra over a wider area as opposed to just around your body, while also tapping into your opponent's senses to trick them with something that just wasn't there. It required a lot of imagination and a lot of ingenuity, and that was something Naruto was in no short supply of. As long as the user had an idea of what the illusion would look, smell, taste, sound, and feel like, then they would be able to use it to effectively rope someone into what was essentially a false scenario. After Yakumo explained the basics of genjutsu to Naruto, she then had him cast a simple illusion to create a sign in the middle of an area where there wasn't one. Understandably, Naruto struggled with this at the beginning, even with his friend's explanations and guidance. But after she walked it through him after a period of a few weeks of trial and error, his capabilities in the area slowly started to take hold. Soon he was able to cast and produce small-scale genjutsu, which took the form of extra objects in places where there weren't any, and illusions that changed the text of signs. The last one proved to be a great deal of fun to practice, as one Friday afternoon at the end of a long week of training, the blonde fire starter used it to fool a few shop owners and customers by altering the names at the front of their businesses, swapping signs, scrambling the kanji, and often changing the names of locations to words that weren't what you would call appropriate. Naruto and Yakumo had a good time pulling these subtle pranks as part of their exercises, which soon became a regular thing for them in the weeks to follow, especially after the blonde managed to gain some level of experience and competence casting illusions. His success in this field even gave Naruto further ideas to experiment with in the future, where instead of casting genjutsu with chakra, he would try pulling off optical illusions with his body. It was something he kept in mind as the pair's training progressed into its next stages, and the two of them slowly started getting better and better at utilizing the skills in their arsenal. Despite the speedy progress the odd duo made over the first few weeks, Naruto still felt that he was lacking something significant in the combat department, something that would help him to use the power that he had in his body to better effect. Sure, it was one thing to hit hard and run fast, but all his physical capabilities and feats amounted to nothing if he couldn't hit someone properly or trade blows with them without getting beaten up himself. After one taijutsu session in class, where he was able to watch Sasuke and Kiba mop the floor with their partners, the boy realized that what he was missing was a proper, distinctive style of form that could iron out his taijutsu, take advantage of his raw strength, and grant him a greater edge in a close combat situation. It was something he was given time to ponder over one Sunday morning, where after a long, hard week of studying and training with Yakumo, the whiskered child found himself wandering alone through the village streets, trying to find some way to occupy himself. After the first month and a half of training, early Sunday morning, in the weeks to follow since the start of his heavily involved training program with his newfound companion, Naruto had also taken on board Shuriken Jutsu and implemented some practice time for it into his timetable, hopefully to improve himself in time so that he could do some training with Yakumo. For the children coming from big wig clans and families within the village, acquiring the tools to conduct this branch of shinobi training was easy and didn't result in any issues for them. Naruto, however, being an orphan of only 6 or so with no family or clan of his own, struggled to get his hands on any weapons he needed to practice with. Not only were the teachers reluctant to lend a bunch of dangerous ninja tools to him, they were also hesitant about loaning them out to someone of his background. This was something that really annoyed the blonde, but also encouraged him to think outside the box and discover different ways and means to train in shuriken jutsu. As it turns out, the driven and sharp-minded youngster was able to come up with an appropriate resource in the form of rocks and pebbles. Able to function as incredibly versatile projectiles, as well as giving him a variety of odd and complex shapes to work with, Naruto was able to use the very environment itself to load himself up on tools from which he was able to train with. Every time he wanted to practice his throwing between his sessions with Yakumo, Naruto would find himself a quiet alleyway or a spot out in the park away from the village and do some target practice by hawking rocks at various angles towards a number of strategically placed targets. These took the form of cans, discarded boxes with painted circles on them, pieces of tinfoil, and strings. Whenever he wasn't doing strength exercises or taijutsu lessons, the determined blonde would work on his throwing arm. At first his technique started out stiff, clumsy, and his aim was all over the place as he demonstrated several times during class practice. But in studying some of the books he was able to come across at the Academy's Resource Center and asking Yakumo for some tips, he was able to modify and correct the aim, distance, and trajectory of his throws. Soon he was knocking over cans from an average distance of 80 to 100 yards a feet, which was quite impressive for an academy student with a handful of pebbles. However, it wasn't just distance and accuracy along a straight line Naruto was working on either. On this day, the child had opted for a different kind of practice. Standing in the middle of a dingy alleyway surrounded by trash cans with random targets set up around him, the orphan was not only working on trying to throw multiple rocks at the same time, but was also attempting to alter their trajectories by ricocheting them and bouncing off of stationary targets to hit another. This would then hopefully lead to him being able to bounce rocks off other airborne rocks. Sure, it sounded simple in theory, but it was ludicrously difficult. Panting heavily as he stood in the middle of the walkway, covered in dirt and bruises, with a cut over his temple, Naruto then crossed his arm over and chucked the handful of pebbles he had in his hand outwards. The 3 rocks flew out, spinning on their respective axis to pelt 3 different targets down the alley. The instant he heard the individual clangs, the blonde spun around, grunted and chucked another pebble upwards, bouncing it off a trash can lid and up towards a can, which he managed to knock over with a loud clatter. Gritting his teeth, the child then reached into his shorts pocket and drew another 2 rocks, which he clenched tightly between his fingers. Not enough, the boy breathed out, glancing over his shoulder towards another 2 targets spaced out in the narrow corridor. Not good enough. With a yell, he turned and threw the rocks, watching them separate and strike their targets with 2 loud, clap, sounds echoing down the walkway. And so, he kept on going, stopping every so often to reload. Sometime later, after spending the better part of dawn giving himself blisters on his fingers and palms with his makeshift shuriken jutsu training, Naruto wiping himself down with a rag he'd left in one of the building panels then went on an aimless march around the village's multiple clan compounds and suburbs. The cheerful 6-year-old, his hands resting comfortably in the pockets of his orange vest and sandals scraping against the floor of the road, quietly explored the local neighborhood he'd unexpectedly wandered into. So far, his adventure through what he assumed was the upper-class part of Konoha had been relatively uneventful, with most of the villagers he'd passed so far steering clear of him, as usual, while he ambled down the road. Chin held high and eyes wide with curiosity, the child allowed his mind to mosey, his thoughts being dominated by ideas and images of his most recent training runs. As fun and eventful his sessions with Yakumo had been so far, the young man was still quite troubled by the topic regarding his fighting style. As much as he tried to suppress the issues by occupying himself with other activities such as the one from this morning, it was still a problem that kept on popping up in his head and giving him grief. He thought to himself while looking down at his hand and clenching it. I've gotten much better at taijutsu, but my form is too straightforward and easy to read. I need something with a little more bang to it. Something sharper. He then peered upwards and focused his attention on the sky. I could ask Ya-chan, though I don't think her clan uses any good taijutsu. She said her family were genjutsu specialists, which didn't quite translate as taijutsu specialists. So, if they didn't have any good hand-to-hand styles, then who did? While Naruto was strolling down a road behind some private estates, in a district he wasn't too familiar with, completely lost in his thoughts, the blonde's head suddenly perked up when his ears picked up the distinct sounds of shouting and foot stomping. Tracing the noises towards one of the properties a little further down the dirt path, the aspiring shinobi in training jogged on over to check it out. Vaulting up onto the ceramic roof of the wall surrounding the enormous home, Naruto then crouched down on the platform and took a quick peek at the garden. Much to his surprise, the whiskered academy student found himself staring down at an enormous dirt courtyard with over 24 children standing in the center of it, boys and girls around his age, capped with brown and dark blue hair respectively, and all dressed in matching gray training gis. What's more, all the kids were arranged into rows, dropped into horse riding stances, and were currently practicing palm thrusts under the supervision of their trainer. Every time they threw an attack, all the children shouted at the top of their lungs in perfect unison. There was a brief pause between each strike and, during each stop, the teacher walking between their rows would come up behind one of the children and correct their stances or position, just to make sure they were doing the exercises properly. This meticulous and repetitive form of practice was something that would normally be found in a typical dojo or a self-defense class, where youngsters were trained for competition purposes or otherwise. But as Naruto observed from his spot, on top of the perimeter wall, this wasn't just some ordinary martial arts class. On closer inspection, Naruto quickly realized that he'd actually wandered into the Hyuga clan district and had just happened to come across one of their private compounds, where members of the powerful family were currently practicing the basic techniques associated with their world-famous taijutsu style, Juken, gentle fist. This was something that Naruto wasn't expecting to stumble across while on his little village walk, despite living in a Konoha dominated by shinobi clans who practiced their arts openly, but it certainly wasn't unwelcome. In fact, the blonde cracked a genuine smile as he made himself comfortable and proceeded to watch the class with interest. As the children continued going through their palm exercises, their instructor, a tall Hyuga kunoichi with bob-style brown hair, pale skin, crystal blue eyes, a scar across her right cheek, and wearing a purple chi-pao kimono, walked between them with a stern expression in play. During which time she began to speak. Remember, every movement you make must be accompanied by a breath, and every step a pause. You must be fluid with each of your strikes, but also decisive, inhaling and exhaling throughout. Any attempts to hold yourself back or restrict your movements will result in rigid attacks and a fragile defense. She then stepped over to a young girl and pushed her arm up when she noticed she was hitting too low. Feel the ground and your surroundings. Breathe and maintain your focus. And never let your guard down. Understand? Hi, sensei. The collective response of the students echoed across the area, informing the kunoichi that all her students understood. With a nod, she then turned around and headed back out of the formation to begin moving around the outside. Change it up. Crescent repulse and double palm strikes. On my count. She then heard a loud stomp as every single child stepped forward with their left foot and assumed attack stances. Ready. 1, 2, 3. The woman counted on and watched as all her students began executing 2 simultaneous techniques, one after the other with both arms. Naruto quickly became fascinated and enamored in the training session taking place in front of him and continued to watch silently for the next few minutes. Upon seeing the kunoichi woman sternly correct 4 of her students by having the others stop and getting the offenders to perform the techniques individually, the blonde then decided to join in on the fun. He did so by standing up on the roof, assuming the gentle fist stance that the children were using and copying their movements at the kunoichi's count. His arms moved in semi-circles around his body as he performed a stepping flourish, followed by a return of both palms to the front before pushing out with them. He then repeated the motion over and over, making sure to stick to the pattern and maintain his footing on the tiled roof. When he felt his body was too rigid, he matched his breathing techniques with his body movements and, sure enough, he started to execute his technique with grace and precision. This taijutsu is really cool, Naruto thought, his heart racing with excitement as he continued to move in a way that was completely subversive to his usual style. Man, what else can they do? For the next half an hour or so Naruto remained on that wall, copying and mimicking the techniques being practiced down below. When the children moved into practicing simultaneous deflection and counter-attacks with a partner, Naruto did the same, practicing being both the attacker and the defender with his own shadow. During this period, the kunoichi instructor below suddenly took notice of the blonde boy up on the top of the wall. As her students continued with their session, she watched the whisker-marked child in the hoodie for several moments, raising an eyebrow as she took notice of how he was executing each technique with confidence and poise. He's got a really strong base stance, the woman observed, tilting her head as she watched the boy continue to parry and counter on command. From what she could tell, he was doing surprisingly well. Unfortunately, just as Naruto was starting to get into the practice, he suddenly heard a voice yell out to him. "Hey, you!" Looking down at the street, the orphan suddenly spotted a Hyuga male with a ponytail and wearing a shinobi uniform glaring up at him. A rather irritated expression was currently slapped across his face. "What do you think you're doing up there? Get down. Now." Uh-oh. Quickly disengaging from his stance, a surprised Naruto turned tail and ran, jumping down from the wall and sprinting away as fast as he could. The Hyuga Chunin gave chase, but then gave up halfway down the road when the child managed to disappear around the corner seconds later. Figuring it wasn't worth going after him, Hoito Hyuga gave a low sigh and turned to head back inside. The kunoichi instructor meanwhile, after seeing the blonde take flight, cracked a small smile before returning to coach her students, all of whom had been too busy to notice the commotion going on nearby. As for Naruto, as he sprinted down the road in his effort to not get caught, grinned broadly as he was then hit by a wicked idea. "I should bring Yakumo next time. She definitely has to check this out. That first visit to the Hyuga clan compound wouldn't be Naruto's last." In fact, after his little peeping session, the orphan began visiting the estate every morning at the exact same time, so that he could watch and observe the taijutsu classes being held in that central courtyard. And true to his word, he even brought Yakumo along following their early morning training in the woods so that the two academy students could observe what was going on. After the first 2 weeks, the orphan and the heiress were able to get a solid grasp of all the days and times each of the classes were held. There were 2 classes held on every day of the week in the mornings and afternoons, and 1 held on the mornings of both Saturday and Sunday. During these brisk 2-hour periods, the youngest members of the Hyuga clan's main and branch family members would gather and form into rows, which were divided by age and experience. From there, under the keen eye of their Jonin instructor, the children would then practice their basic techniques including stances, footwork, and handwork before being paired up to practice through sparring. Thanks to their frequent attendance to these proceedings, Naruto and Yakumo were given plenty of opportunities to observe and record how all of them practiced. The pair's part wasn't just limited to spectators either. Over the course of the next several months, Naruto and Yakumo were able to join in on the classes and copy the routines from a distance, allowing the two of them to work on their techniques and skills being taught at the same time as the children. They were also able to correct themselves by also copying the movements of the kids and making all the corrections the teacher pointed out to her group. Barring any interruptions with any Hyuga clan guards that happened to be on duty, Naruto and his best friend were able to get a full and decent morning of taijutsu into their routine. And with that, another, final addition was added to the pair's schedule. After making a few adjustments, both Naruto and Yakumo had their morning of taijutsu training in the Hyuga clan district where they would mirror and glean ideas off the group's morning classes and add it to their own. From there, their Monday to Friday schedule followed a very straightforward and concrete timetable. Early morning session obstacle, forest run, weightlifting, taijutsu, Hyuga clan compound, for 3 hours. School, first period plus second period. Recess, studying for 15 minutes. School, third plus fourth period. Lunch, studying for half an hour. School, fifth period. Afternoon session, ninjutsu and genjutsu training for 2 hours. As for their weekends, Naruto and Yakumo agreed to try and meet up on the Saturday so that they could iron out more of their taijutsu, ninjutsu, genjutsu, and bookwork depending on their progress. Seeing as how the two of them needed to commit a lot of time to increasing their stamina and refining their strength respectively, most of the next few months were solely devoted to polishing up their physical capabilities and endurance. Naruto of course went with his own workout for this, but at the same time helped Yakumo out a great deal, making sure she didn't overdo it and pass out every time. By setting an entire day aside and using it for this routine, they were able to cover a lot in a very short amount of time. Depending on how long they spent their Saturday together, they pretty much saw one another every day of the week. As for their Sunday, this was their rest day, a day where they would be able to collect their thoughts and spend some time away from one another for a breather. That was of course if they didn't sneak out to meet up at the park to just have a day of play or go for some noodles down at Ichiraku's ramen stand. The first time Naruto took Yakumo down to the father and daughter's famed restaurant turned out to be one of the more memorable and heartwarming moments the pair shared thus far. After the second month of training. And you say that this place has the best noodles sold anywhere in the village? Yakumo, wearing a fitting light brown kimono and red obi, asked as she walked with Naruto up to the front of the small stand resting close to the village's center. When she looked over the front of the local store, a look of immediate curiosity quickly came over her. Strange. My parents never told me about this place. In fact, they always told me that the bar across the street sold the best noodles. Trust me, Ya-chan, Naruto replied with a big, cheesy grin on his face as he pushed back the curtain in front of him and held a hand to his female friend. The ramen that Oji-san makes at his shop is really, really awesome. I don't want to hype his stuff up too much before you try it, but I honestly just can't help myself. His regular miso ramen and pork combo will floor you on your first bite. He then gave a shrug at the end. At least that's what I think. Yakumo, seeing the excitement gleaming in the boy's eyes as he looked back at her, giggled a little while an eyebrow. You really want me to like these noodles, don't you? The blonde answered by inhaling deeply. Yes. I definitely do. While his simple response had the girl laugh even more into her hand, the whiskered hero then beckoned her in. Look, I don't want to try and convince you with words. Just try it out and see for yourself what I mean. He then pushed the curtain back for the brunette, allowing a pleased Yakumo to pass under it and approach the stools that waited them on the other side. Finding a seat towards the left on the main counter, the pair sat side by side and made themselves comfortable. As soon as they did, they were greeted by the very pleasant yet surprised face of the chef's teenage daughter Ayame, who blinked when she saw her store's favorite customer smiling back at them along with a girl she'd never met before. Oh, hello there, Naruto-kun, the older girl behind the bar greeted in her usual, upbeat tone. Hey, Onichan, the whiskered child replied with a wave, at the same time hopping a little on his stool. What's up? Having a good day? Yes. It's been a really great day so far. Not many customers, but the peace and quiet has allowed me to do a lot of cleaning up around the place, Ayame answered. That's good. And where's Gigi? He's in the back checking out the stocks, Ayame answered. She then directed her attention to the properly dressed girl sitting beside the vest-wearing child. Taking note of her well-kept hair, neatly pressed kimono, and smooth skin, the chef's daughter initially thought she was looking at someone who was either rich or royalty. Who's the girl? Naruto-kun. Ah, of course. Where are my manners? The blonde then beamed across at Yakumo and gestured to her happily. Ayame-ni-chan, this is my best friend Yakumo-chan from the Kurama clan. When the girl raised a hand to wave tentatively, Naruto then gestured back to the older girl. She hasn't eaten at this place before, so I brought her in to try out some of your dad's awesome ramen. There was a moment of stunned pause in which Ayame momentarily felt her jaw drop at the sight of Naruto's companion smiling bashfully in her direction. Managing to stifle a gasp when her mind finally processed the information given to her, the young adult cook held a hand up to her lips as a smile reappeared. Shish, she's your friend, Naruto-kun. When she saw the whiskered child nod enthusiastically, the teen responded by leaning forward excitedly. Oh my gosh. That's amazing. You managed to bring a friend to the restaurant. Dad, she suddenly called into the back. A few seconds after her shout, which momentarily confused both Naruto and Yakumo, the distinct voice of the owner of the store answered back. What is it, Ayame? It's Naruto-kun. Come take a look. While the two children appeared completely confused by the commotion, they were soon joined by the old owner of the restaurant. His portly, gray-haired form ducking into view from the back of the store, the master noodle chef Tuki found himself under the gazes of not only his daughter, but the pair of young customers who were waiting at the counter. What's going on? Is there something wrong? The adult asked as he approached the bench. Beaming brilliantly, the brunette then gestured over the counter towards the kids. Look, Dad. Naruto-kun brought a friend to try out your noodles. A surprised Tuki then peered over. He did? He asked in a surprised tone, quickly spotting the very distinctive face of Naruto and then the girl sitting alongside him. Upon looking the wide-eyed children over and seeing that they were indeed together, the old man then grinned broadly before giving out a booming laugh of joy. Ha ha. Well, isn't that great? Little Naruto managed to make a girlfriend. How about that? When the two children blushed at his statement and smiled down at the desk in front of them in embarrassment, Ayame quickly noticed their reactions and waved her hands at her old man. No, Dad. Not girlfriend. A friend, she corrected, causing her father to balk. Someone he plays with. Oh, really? When he saw his daughter nod, he then looked back at the red-faced Naruto and Yakumo and smiled apologetically at them. Oops. I'm so sorry you two. I think I may have jumped the gun a little bit. That's okay, sir, Naruto said, in a rather uncharacteristically quiet voice as he shuffled a bit in his seat. Everyone makes mistakes. Why yeah, it's fine, Yakumo also whispered, throwing a few glances across at her blonde friend and receiving several back in return. When the pair's eyes met, they felt their faces heat up even more, which prompted them to look away while smiling happily. Though observing the pair drew a giggle from Ayame, a grinning Tuki puffed his chest out and wisely decided to break the air of awkwardness he'd inadvertently created. Well, in any case, I'm so glad to see you're starting to hang out with others your own age, kid. Looks like your persistence is finally starting to pay off. He then raised his right hand and flashed the children a thumbs up. Nice going. Naruto, feeling himself perk back up, grinned at one of the only adult males in his life he considered a role model and inspirational figure. Thank you, Gigi. Next to Iruka and Hiruzen, Tuki and his daughter were like family to him, so it really meant a lot to hear this kind of encouragement coming from him. A chortle of pride left the chef's lips as he set his hand back down. Like I always say, it's always best to enjoy life with others rather than by yourself. Though it may take a while for you to find someone you want to spend the best years of your youth with, you'll eventually get there if you keep on trying. Upon imparting these words of wisdom to his two customers, he then moved on to business as usual. So, what can I get you two troublemakers today? Finally managing to recover as well, Yakumo's head also went up when she saw the old man look in her direction. Naruto-kun said you guys make the best ramen in the village. Because we haven't had any lunch yet, I would very much like to try some, the girl said, shooting a grin across at the boy next to her, who she saw respond in kind. Oh ho, is that so? Tuki chuckled, before then glancing over at Naruto enthusiastically. My, that truly is a shining review, if I ever heard one. Now I'm wondering whether Naruto is telling the truth, or he's just making you say that so that he can get a free bowl of ramen today. When he saw the blonde snicker and rub the back of his head bashfully from the smiles he received from the father and daughter, the head chef then nodded. Very well then, Ayame. Yes, Papa, let's give these two hungry kids something to eat, the man said with a grin. Looking at them, I'd say they're going to need all the energy they can get for whatever ball games they have planned later in the park. In response, the brunette smiled and nodded her head briskly. All right, 2 regular miso noodles coming right up. She then promptly headed back to get the stoves fired up. From there, both Naruto and Yakumo spent the next few minutes at the counter, waiting patiently side by side as the sounds of kitchen utensils echoed into their midst. All the while the owner of the store kept them company, asking his favorite customer where he'd met the girl and where she came from. Understandably, the blonde talked about his brunette friend in detail, with Ayame also listening in so that she didn't miss out on any second of the story. By the time their orders finally came out, 2 more customers had arrived at the store, both of whom were promptly tended to by the daughter. The moment the 2 steaming bowls of deliciously smelling broth and noodles were set down before them, both Naruto and Yakumo clapped their hands together, gave a simultaneous "itadakimasu," and quickly picked up a set of chopsticks and a spoon each. Upon taking the spoons into their dominant hands first, the pair then dipped them into their respective bowls, during which time Naruto sat back and watched Yakumo take her first tentative serving. After blowing on her spoon to cool it, she then took a sip. The moment she did, her eyes flicked open and a light quickly shone from her pupils. It's good, she whispered in surprise, smile forming as she dipped her spoon in once again. It's very good. While an observing Tyuki grinned victoriously and crossed his arms, and observing Naruto also smiled broadly across at the young painter. See, I told you you'd like it. When the girl gave him a bright smile, the pair then looked away from each other and went straight back into their meals, with Naruto taking up a length of noodles with his chopsticks and joyfully inhaling them. And so that's pretty much how the next several months came and went, both Naruto and Yakumo working together to improve their stamina, their shinobi skills, and their jutsu respectively. While the pair obviously struggled at the beginning when they were just starting out on their road to ninjahood, as time went on and the 2 of them began focusing more intensely on the tasks that they'd laid out for themselves, the training gradually started to get easier and easier. With the knowledge that they were getting stronger with each passing day being ever present in their minds and bodies, the pair started adding more and more to their workouts to keep the development going at a steady pace. They increased their weights, extended their runs, began manipulating chakra on a more regular basis, studied harder material, and began practicing jutsu more frequently. As a result, their stamina grew and so did their efficiency and success at using jutsu. Yakumo, having finally reached a reasonable level of fitness after 6 months of hard work and action, started to be able to use the basic supplementary techniques taught to her by Naruto more regularly, a success that she was able to demonstrate in class during one of Suzume-sensei's outdoor lessons. Whereas before she would have failed at producing even a single transformation miserably, the girl was overjoyed when she managed to use the transformation without passing out and was applauded for her accomplishment. As for the obstacle run, she was also able to complete it along with the rest of her peers and set a good time for it, a feat that her parents found out about and congratulated her for it. As for Naruto, his own grades and status as dead last in the class also began to change. Thanks to Yakumo's counsel and encouragement, the boy began committing himself to his lessons like any good student would, transforming from a boy who would interrupt lessons with pranks or calling out, to one who would concentrate on his studies and raise his hand to answer questions. It was this noticeable change in behavior and attitude that Iruka observed straight away and praised his normally troublesome student for his increase in focus and improvement during their quizzes and tests. And then, when it came to the boy being tested on his ninjutsu and taijutsu skills, Naruto was finally able to break his string of losses with monumental impact. After the 7th month of training, The taijutsu classes held in the courtyard outside of the academy by Iruka-sensei was noted by his students to be one of the more popular lessons held by the teacher. Not only did the session allow for the children to get out, stretch their legs, and breathe air that wasn't the stuffy, sweaty, paper-tinted confines of their homeroom, but also gave them the opportunity to practice the most exciting art of shinobi philosophy combat. Everyone wanted to have a piece of the action. Whether they were lazy sloths from the Nara clan or gung-ho fighters from the Inuzuka clan, every child in the Chunin's youngest ranks were eager to get involved. While most were keen to participate whenever the instructor called for volunteers, some of the less motivated ones were just happy to stand back and observe. Chief among which were Shikamaru and Choji, both of whom could often be seen standing on the very edge of the class and watching their peers smack each other around over a shared bag of chips. Like every other taijutsu class held by Iruka, the entire session had started off great. The teacher called students forward one pair at a time to perform the sign of confrontation and show their stuff, with each group giving a solid performance all throughout. Once each round was finished, both opponents were expected to finish up with the sign of reconciliation to show that the children still held respect and friendship towards one another as students in the same school. Understandably, when Sasuke Uchiha's name was called, all the girls who were standing on the sidelines gave him a big cheer of support and adulation, with Ino and Sakura in particular being his most vocal of supporters. Unfortunately, the same could not be said for Naruto when he came up. Even though the boy came onto the field with a far more dignified air and approach than he had in lessons before, his appearance didn't even raise any kind of positive response. In fact, after having not seen the child perform for quite a while after his rather embarrassing knockdown by Sasuke on their very first lesson with Iruka last year, the kids all whispered and made bets amongst themselves over how quickly the whiskered boy was going to get beaten this time. Since he was fighting Kiba in this round, everyone believed that his match was only going to last a few seconds. Everyone braced themselves and waited for the inevitable moment where the spiky-haired kid would get sent flying out of the ring by a single punch after charging head-on into his opponent. However, much to everyone's shock, as soon as Kiba dashed in with a swing, Naruto retaliated with superb effect. A loud crack rang out as the young Inuzuka clansman was suddenly sent skidding back across the dirt after attempting to block a solid counter thrown by his foe. His feet digging into the floor to stop himself from flying, the scruffy-haired boy with the red marks on his cheeks and sharp eyes dropped to his knee and panted heavily. When he looked up from his crouched-over position and saw the dust start to settle, he spotted Naruto standing several feet away with his fist extended and a very intense look on his face. Iruka blinked in surprise at seeing the display of raw strength and precision by the whiskered child, while the rest of his class standing around him gaped in astonishment. "Wow, did you see that?" Ino asked, while looking between the intensely glaring Naruto and the surprised Kiba in disbelief. "That was insane." "Why yeah," Sakura stuttered, raising her hands to her chin as she stared across at the blonde in amazement. "He just knocked Kiba back with one punch, and after dodging all those fast slashes and kicks too." Amy, looking across at her companions beside her, stuttered nervously. "Have you ever seen the class clown do that before?" Her friend Kasumi, a tall girl with a mean face and orange, curly hair, shook it in response. No, I haven't." As Iruka took a deep breath and proceeded to jot down notes, Kiba, reaching up to brush his chin to make sure he wasn't bleeding, then glanced up at the boy in alarm. "He hit me so hard my blocking arm bounced off my face." "What the hell?" When he looked back up towards the blonde youngster and saw him glaring back at him from his fighting stance, the wild-looking Inuzuka let out a low growl before dashing forward. "I don't know how he did that, but I'll get him this time." That must have just been a lucky shot. He knew Naruto, the overly ambitious, talentless, dead last and outcast of the class, who was beaten consecutively in every test and subject by every other student. As much as he liked the kid's bravado, Kiba knew that he absolutely sucked at being a shinobi. There was no way an orphan like him could go toe-to-toe with a trained member of the main family of the Inuzuka clan. It was ludicrous. But as Kiba leapt at Naruto and swung at him with a punch, the blonde effortlessly sidestepped around him, before beginning to dodge and parry the flurry of blows that came afterwards. The Inuzuka grunted and shouted as he lashed out at the child with punch after punch, his fists whooshing through the air as he attempted to nail his target. But try as he might, Naruto just kept calmly hopping and slipping around him, the occasionally occurring thud ringing out as he deflected each of his punches. As the little spar dragged on, the kids watching from the sidelines were in somewhat awe of the display, as they could see Naruto was doing pretty damn well against the kid who was regarded as the second best taijutsu fighter in the class. Even Iruka was blown away by what was happening, especially when he saw Naruto parry Kiba's hook and shove him back with a palm strike to the chest, before checking the kid's kick and then shoving him back a second time in a row for distance. Naruto was fighting defensively using some very slick, textbook moves. Naruto never fought defensively. On top of all that, as the rest of the kids watched Naruto and Kiba duke it out, the class's resident prodigy Sasuke Uchiha was also looking on with a somewhat astonished gaze. His dark eyes traced the blonde's movements as he moved about the small ring with barely any effort, using deft footwork and parrying techniques that the boy didn't know the blonde had. What's more, his unperturbed expression was a stark contrast to Kiba's aggressive the 6-year-old Inuzuka shouting as he attempted to land a hook against Naruto. Inhaling deeply as he stepped around Kiba when the kid dove at him with a haymaker, Naruto then switched his hand positions into a southpaw stance, his left fist being drawn to his face while his right fist remained extended in a very professional fashion. He then watched as Kiba spun back around to glare at him, his face dripping with sweat and teeth clenched tightly. When the blonde noticed the frustration burning in the kid's eyes, the whiskered child smiled and relaxed, allowing his fists to relax and become open hands. Iruka noticed this right away and, for the first time in his life as a teacher, shook his head at Naruto in a double take. Hold on, that looks exactly like Hinata's stance. Watching Naruto lower his posture as he held a palm forward, the man then glanced across at the purple-haired girl in question, who he saw had also noticed this distinct change. The heiress to the Hyuga clan, hands clenched at her sides, blinked in amazement. That's a main family Juken form. Kiba, not paying any mind to the boy's posture alteration, huffed before rushing forward. Come on, dead last. Attack me. He barked, his feet pounding against the floor as he loaded back his fist for a punch. Naruto, meanwhile, remaining completely at ease, shrugged back at the charging boy. Okay, he answered. Everything that happened next, happened in an instant. The second Kiba's fist flew towards Naruto's head, the blonde effortlessly swung his guard arm around and slapped the kid's attack aside. This maneuver effortlessly cracked open the Inuzuka's defense and left him wide open for a follow-up, which the whiskered boy delivered to him in the form of a swift palm strike to the stomach. His hand cut through the air and buried into Kiba's torso like a lance, impacting with a dull crack that not only knocked the air out of the scruffy boy's lungs, but hit with such force it lifted him off his feet. The moment spit came flying out of Kiba's gaping mouth, the boy was sent blasting and bouncing several meters out of the ring. His body practically tumbled head over across the dirt before coming to a crumpled stop several yards from the white circle. When the dust settled, it left Kiba lying on his back and Naruto standing in the center of the arena with his hand out and index and middle fingers extended. As Kiba's sprawled out form coughed and the blonde stepped out of his stance, the initially stunned crowd of children began to chatter excitedly, with Iruka snapping out of his trance to give his final verdict. Alright. That was an incredibly well-fought round. Good job you two. Especially you, Naruto, the man with the scar across his nose said, earning a cheerful smile and nod from the boy in question. You okay, Kiba? Why yeah, the boy groaned and sniffled, slowly pushing himself back up. I think so. His pride feeling even more bruised than his ribs, the scrappy young kid took his time finding both his feet and his balance. It was only when he suddenly saw Naruto's hand being held out to him that he managed to completely regain his sense of awareness, resulting in him looking up at the class clown to see his whiskered face grinning back at him. Here. Need some help? Naruto asked. Blinking a little in surprise at being given a hand by the normally argumentative and braggy blonde, Kiba inevitably accepted the boy's offer and locked grips, allowing himself to be hauled to his feet. As soon as he was up, the brown-haired Inuzuka smiled. Thanks, man. Once he was back up and was able to dust down his hooded jacket, the boy then gave Naruto a toothy grin. Damn, I didn't know you could fight so well. How did you do that? Naruto smiled. Don't know. I've just had a lot of practice in my free time recently. Guess I just didn't notice how much I'd improved. He then raised his fist and bumped the boy in the arm. Next time watch out, 'cause I might wind up hitting you with something a little bit nastier than just a palm strike. If I'm feeling mean anyway. At first recoiling at this remark, Kiba then gave a big laugh before smirking at the kid. I'll keep that in mind. He then lifted his fist and bumped Knuckles with him. But just so you know, I won't let you tag me so easily next time. That I can promise you. Hey, we'll see, Dadbao, Naruto grinned, before the two of them eventually stepped away from one another and gave their opponent the sign of reconciliation. Once they did, the pair then stepped away from one another and walked back over to join the others. Iruka looked on approvingly as the student he viewed as a younger brother reunited with his peers, all of whom were now regarding Naruto with a little more respect and intrigue than before. While Kiba was greeted by a patiently waiting Shino, who was quick to remark about his defeat, Sasuke was currently standing on the edge of the crowd and staring hard at the blonde who'd dealt the Inuzuka such a handy loss. Obviously, the whiskered kid's performance had garnered quite a bit of attention from the rest of the class, most notably the room's star pupil and prodigy. Even Hinata, the normally quiet and most reserved of the students, was giving the boy a hard glare. As all of this was going on, up on the second floor of the academy building, in the homeroom of the Kunoichi Suzume's class, the familiar face of Naruto's close friend Yakumo Kurama could be seen looking down at the courtyard from the very back. Noticing the PE and taijutsu session that was taking place through the glass, the brunette had watched the entire class with Iruka's group go down. Upon seeing Naruto take to the ring and use his newly refined fighting style to deliver a swift defeat to one of the boys, a warm smile of delight crossed her lips. Suffice to say that their efforts together were certainly starting to pay with interest. XXX. A few weeks later. 1. Ha. 2. Ha. 3. Ha. Dig deep. Find your inner strength. Let the enemy know you are delivering the blow, not receiving it, the firm, commanding voice of the female Hyuga instructor shouted as she walked between the rows of 20 adolescent branch and main clan students. Her hands propped behind her and white eyes wide open, the female with the scar across her cheek scanned the rows of tiny soldiers in front of her, watching as they were all in a striking position. Palms fully extended, the children, all arranged in order from youngest to oldest, remained locked in position with their eyes focused on the area ahead of them. It was a very dignified spectacle, seeing all the young members of the clan sticking to their task and listening to their teacher so diligently. Obviously, she was greatly respected by the members of her clan for her skill and discipline. The brown-haired woman then spotted a discrepancy amongst her ranks and marched forward, grabbing the guard hand of one of her students and nudging it towards his ribs. She then stepped back as the child in question, a young Hyuga male with dark brown hair tied into a top knot, broke out a worried sweat. In this position, keep the hand positioned over your center mass to protect your vital areas. Do not give the enemy any openings to exploit. Understood. Hi, Fujiko-sensei. The boy shouted back, at the same time firming up his stance. Nodding, the woman then moved on down the rows towards the back, inspecting everyone's stances. After lightly stepping on the back foot of a student who had overextended it, prompting him to slide it back into place, she then stopped at the final row when she noticed something odd about the formation. It wasn't the fact that the students were doing anything incorrectly, no. All of them were lined up and standing perfectly. It was the fact that two of the students, who were standing on the far left of the arrangement, weren't members of any of the Hyuga clan families at all. Naruto and Yakumo, who had been watching quietly from the entrance since the start of the lesson a few minutes ago, had decided to come out to join the class and inset themselves into their ranks. Hoping that they would go unnoticed, the two children had both left their vest and art bag by the archway, and approached the group wearing only the shirt, pants and kimono they were wearing respectively. The two sneaky shinobi in training had managed to slip into the back row of 7-year-old Hyuga students and had been practicing the techniques with their class without drawing any attention to themselves. That was until the instructor, Fujiko, marched towards the back to inspect her troops. It was a rather bizarre and unexpected turn of events. For the next minute the kunoichi stood there staring down at the pair curiously, at the same time observing as several of her students turned their attention to them yet remained in their fighting stances. After looking over the out-of-place 7-year-olds for a moment, the woman raised an eyebrow as she saw they were doing their best not to move in any way. This was obvious from the way they had their eyes fixed on the space ahead and all their focus set squarely on the lesson. These are the two children that have been showing up and watching our lessons for the last few months, Fujiko thought, her eyes tracing over the children and taking note of their forms. They haven't missed a single one. This much was clear from how clean and steady their stances were. She hadn't seen anything like it. Noticing the quality of their postures had the woman nod her head in an impressed manner. After several moments of tense silence and watching the pair sweat a little bit out of sheer nerves especially since they'd both been caught, Fujiko then cracked a smile and looked back at her class. Noticing the children were looking back at her, her expression steeled once more and she shouted, "Hey! Who said any of you could break form?" She then watched all the children snap back to their previous positions before she once again glanced down at the newcomers. "Keep that stance tight and center of gravity low. Understand?" Naruto and Yakumo nodded simultaneously. "Hi." Smiling brightly, as the intrigue of taking on two outsiders into their class seemed like quite a fun prospect, the woman then turned and marched on. "Let's get back to it," the Hyuga woman shouted, keeping her hands locked behind her while moving towards the front. Twisting palm strikes. "On my count. 1. Ha. 2. Ha. 3. Ha." And so, class continued, with two surprise additions to the group, both of whom were more than thrilled to be there. After the next 3 months. The most astonishing thing about Naruto and Yakumo's arrangement so far was that despite the multitude of days and hours the pair were spent together, their training had gone on completely unnoticed by most of the village. Apart from the Hyuga household that held the regular taijutsu classes in the courtyard with all their prospective young members, all the other clans were completely oblivious to the pair's secret lessons. Even the parents, teachers and caretakers responsible for overseeing the pair's well-being were unaware of what they were doing in their off time. While Yakumo's parents assumed that their daughter was going out to do painting out in the woods or to walk around Konohagakure, the third Hokage and Iruka thought that Naruto was just occupying his time with something else. Neither of them really had anything to worry because none of them had gotten into any trouble or wound up in hospital for a whole, so they assumed they were making productive use of their time. Self-reliance was the cornerstone to their society after all. Nevertheless, Naruto and Yakumo made sure to keep things discreet, as they didn't want anything or anybody ruining the friendship they had. Neither of them wanted to lose the order, nor did they want to be separated for any reason, as the pair relied on the other to fill in the parts of them that they lacked. Yakumo counted on Naruto's valor, courage, compassion, and spirit to push her through her training, while the blonde hero saw wisdom, guidance, and warmth in the brunette's company, where he found nothing else. As a pair, the duo was able to make breakthroughs in their development and training that they never thought they'd ever be able to achieve in the amount of time that had passed. Despite their unique blend of inaptitude and ambition, in the span of only 6 months, the two of them were able to climb up from the bottom of the barrel and establish themselves as upper mid-tier capable shinobi in training. And all of this came about just from them working together. After coming this far and knowing they still had a long way to go, Naruto and Yakumo didn't want their time together to end. However, as fate would have it, good things like this hardly ever lasted. One Wednesday afternoon, following a rather hectic day at school and an equally hectic day of training, Naruto and Yakumo had once again found themselves whittling the closing hours of their weekday together at one of the village's local parks. Almost immediately upon arriving at the reserve, the two shinobi in training honed in on one of the empty benches and sat themselves down for a rest, where they then spent the next half an hour admiring the sun setting and the interesting